In January 1953, inside the ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, 45,000 people came to see the future of the American automobile. General Motors had turned one of the most famous hotels in the world into a traveling theater of chrome and ambition. There were orchestras, there were dancers, there were concept cars draped in spotlights. But one car stopped people cold. It was small, it was white, it had no exterior door handles, no roll-up windows, and a grille that looked like it was baring its teeth. On every other level, it didn't make sense for Chevrolet, a brand built on affordable sedans for American families, to be showing something this raw, this European, this obviously designed for speed rather than groceries. People pressed close to the rope barriers. They asked the same two questions over and over. When can I buy it? How much? The car was the Corvette, and within 2 years, General Motors would quietly consider killing it before it ever became anything at all. If you watch the channel and enjoy discovering the hidden history inside cars you've known your entire life, a quick note. Most of you are watching on television right now, and if you've been enjoying these stories, sharing this one with someone who loves cars makes a real difference to the future of this channel. A subscription helps too, if you haven't already. And now, back to 1951, where this story actually begins. To understand why the Corvette almost didn't survive, you need to understand the world it was born into. After World War II, American men came home from Europe carrying something the automobile industry hadn't fully anticipated. They had driven, or at least seen, small European sports cars. MGs from Britain, Jaguars, Alphas, low, fast, purposeful machines that felt nothing like the wide, soft American sedans waiting for them back in suburban driveways. The hot rod culture that exploded across California in the late 1940s was part of the same impulse. Young Americans were rebuilding old Fords in garages, stripping weight, swapping engines, chasing speed with whatever they could find. Detroit watched this and mostly misread it, as a phase, as a niche, as something too rough around the edges to become a real market. Harley Earl read it differently. Earl was the most powerful designer in the American automobile industry. He had essentially invented the modern idea of automotive styling as a discipline, building General Motors' art and color section into a department that shaped how millions of Americans understood what a car should look like. He had given America tail fins and two-tone paint. He understood that cars sold feelings as much as transportation. In 1951, Earl attended a road race at Watkins Glen in upstate New York, a converted public road circuit where American drivers competed in sports cars, most of them European imports. Earl watched the small, agile machines navigate the course and walked away with an idea that wouldn't leave him alone. America needed its own sports car, not an imitation of a European design, something American, something Chevrolet could build, something that would cost enough to feel special, but not so much that it became the exclusive territory of the wealthy. The project was assigned the internal code name Opal. A team began sketching. What emerged was the EX122, a two-seat roadster with a fiberglass body, which was chosen not primarily for weight savings or performance, but because fiberglass tooling was faster and cheaper to produce than steel stamping dies. The car was low and sleek, with a pronounced grille, smooth flanks, and a look that owed something to the European sports cars Earl had admired without copying any of them directly. There was one significant problem. Under the skin, the Corvette was not a sports car. It was built on a shortened version of a standard Chevrolet passenger car frame. Its engine was a modified inline six-cylinder, the so-called Blue Flame 6, producing 150 horsepower. Because Chevrolet didn't yet have a manual transmission capable of handling even that modest output, every 1953 Corvette came equipped with a two-speed Powerglide automatic. In an era when the very definition of a sports car involved a driver controlling gears with a hand, when every MG and Triumph and Jaguar that American veterans had fallen for in Europe came with a manual, the Corvette arrived offering none of that. The car that stood in the Waldorf Astoria's ballroom in January 1953 drawing crowds that required management just to keep orderly, was in some fundamental ways wearing a costume. GM's president, Harlow Curtis, gauged the crowd's reaction on the second day of the show and made a decision that would have enormous consequences. He announced that the Corvette would enter production as soon as possible. That decision, made from instinct and crowd energy rather than careful market research, set everything that followed in motion. Production began in June 1953. Not in a purpose-built assembly facility, but in the back of a customer delivery garage on Van Slyke Avenue in Flint, Michigan. The operation was entirely manual, each car assembled almost by hand on a temporary pilot line by a team of workers carefully positioning fiberglass panels that had never been mass-produced before. 300 cars were completed before the year ended. Every single one was painted polo white with a red interior and a black canvas top. Buyers had no other choice. The cars were priced at $3,198, a significant sum in 1953, roughly equivalent to a well-equipped Chevrolet Bel Air sedan, but far less than a comparable imported sports car. To project an image of exclusivity and manage the limited supply, Chevrolet's sales team restricted early deliveries to prominent individuals, mayors, local celebrities, industrial leaders, people whose ownership would generate attention. Dinah Shore received one. General Curtis LeMay received one. John Wayne received one. This created the appearance of desirability. What it couldn't create was actual sales demand. The fabric convertible top leaked. There were no exterior door handles. You reached inside to open the door, which was a European affectation that made no practical sense for an American buyer climbing out of a car in a parking lot in the rain. The side curtains were clip-on plastic panels instead of proper roll-up windows, and the Powerglide automatic transmission, adequate for a family sedan, communicated something to the small community of American sports car buyers that no amount of attractive styling could override. This car was not serious. By late summer of 1953, dealers reported hesitation. Customers who came to look at the Corvette often left without buying. The ones who did buy occasionally returned with complaints. A small pile of unsold 1953 models accumulated on dealer lots as the year turned. For 1954, Chevrolet moved production to a proper assembly plant in St. Louis, Missouri, and planned to build 1,000 cars per month. The price was cut by more than $700, down to $2,274, a 30% reduction in under a year, which sent its own uncomfortable message about confidence in the original price point. Despite everything, only 3,640 Corvettes sold in all of 1954. In the same year, Chevrolet sold 248 750 Bel Air four-door sedans. Inside General Motors, conversations about the future of the Corvette grew quieter and more pointed. Some voices argued for cancellation before deeper losses accumulated. The car had been built on enthusiasm and a crowd's reaction in a hotel ballroom. Enthusiasm wasn't paying the bills. Then something happened that changed every calculation. On September 23, 1954, Ford introduced the Thunderbird. The Thunderbird was everything General Motors executives had quietly feared. It was a two-seat American sports car that looked beautiful, came with a proper V8 engine, and offered amenities, including actual roll-up windows, that the Corvette conspicuously lacked. On the first day Ford's two-seat Roadster appeared in showrooms, customers placed 4,000 orders. At General Motors, the question shifted overnight. It was no longer whether the Corvette should survive. It was whether America's largest automaker could afford to let Ford win the American sports car market without a fight. That reframing kept the Corvette alive long enough for two people to transform it into something the original concept never fully was. The first was Ed Cole, who had become Chevrolet's chief engineer and had championed a new V8 engine, the 265 cubic inch small block that would define American performance for decades. Cole understood that putting this engine into the Corvette wasn't merely a performance upgrade. It was the difference between a car that performed like a sports car and a car that merely resembled one. The second person was a Belgian-born, Russian-raised racing driver and mechanical engineer named Zora Arkus-Duntov, who had been standing in the crowd at the Waldorf Astoria in January 1953 when the Corvette was first unveiled. Duntov was 43 years old that day. He had studied mechanical engineering in Berlin and Leningrad, raced at Le Mans and the Indy 500, built high-performance engine components, and spent his career navigating a world that ran on the logic of speed. He looked at the Corvette and saw, through the attractive fiberglass body, a machine that was not yet what it needed to be, and believed he understood exactly what it needed to become. He wrote a letter to Chevrolet's chief engineer, Ed Cole, describing his observations and his qualifications. Cole hired him. What followed would determine whether the Corvette survived at all. By the end of 1954, the situation was clear enough that a Chevrolet executive reportedly told Duntov directly, "The Corvette is finished." The program was being reconsidered. One scenario under discussion involved converting the Corvette into a sporty trim package for the Bel Air, rather than maintaining it as a standalone model. Duntov put his ideas in writing. In October 1954, he sent a memo to Cole and Maurice Olley, one of GM's senior engineers, making the case not for the Corvette that existed, but for the Corvette that could exist. His argument was specific and rooted in his understanding of the American performance market. The young men who were building hot rods in California garages, who were devouring automotive magazines, who were following road racing with increasing interest, those men would eventually want something that came from a factory instead of a garage. If Chevrolet didn't give it to them, Ford would. The memo was part engineering proposal, part market analysis, and part personal conviction from someone who had spent his life around racing. The memo did not save the Corvette on its own. What saved it was the combination of Duntov's advocacy, Ford's Thunderbird forcing GM's competitive instincts into sharp focus, and the arrival of the small block V8, the engine that had been developed for the standard Chevrolet passenger car line, but whose potential in the Corvette nobody had yet fully tested. For the 1955 model year, the 265 cubic inch V8 became available in the Corvette. It produced 195 horsepower, 30% more than the Blue Flame 6, and it weighed significantly less. The character of the car changed immediately. The Powerglide automatic remained available, but a 3-speed manual transmission was finally offered, which meant buyers could now engage with the car the way sports car drivers expected to engage with a sports car. Only 700 Corvettes sold in 1955. The Ford Thunderbird outsold it by a wide margin. The Corvette was still losing, but now it had the mechanical foundation to become something genuinely different. Duntov saw the opening and moved directly toward it. The strategy Duntov pursued was built around a principle he had articulated in a paper to the Society of Automotive Engineers in 1953. Successful sports car brands were defined by a racing halo provided by a few specialized machines of the same make. It wasn't enough to build a fast car. You had to prove the car was fast in public, on a track, against real competition. In early 1956, Duntov took a pre-production Corvette to Pikes Peak in Colorado and set a new stock car record on the climb. Then he brought a specially prepared 1956 model to Daytona Beach, Florida, for the annual speed runs on the flat ocean sands, working from GM's desert-proving grounds in California. Communicating with Chevrolet engineers over the phone, Duntov developed what became known as the Duntov cam, a specialized camshaft that extracted additional power from the small block. In February 1956, on the hard sand of Daytona Beach, he set a flying mile speed record of 150,183 miles per hour in the modified class. The same month, a team of 4 Corvettes competed in the 12 Hours of Sebring in Florida, the converted wartime airfield circuit that had become one of America's most prestigious endurance races. The Corvettes ran alongside Jaguars, Maseratis, and other established European competitors. One Corvette, driven by John Fitch and Walt Hanskin, finished 9th overall and first in its class. The results were not spectacular by any absolute measure. Sebring was dominated by purpose-built European racing machinery, but they were enough. America's sports car had competed at a serious level and not disgraced itself. Corvette sales rebounded to 3,467 units for 1956. Cole and Duntov had been right. Track exposure was moving the needle. For 1957, the Corvette received fuel injection. Mechanical fuel injection developed in part by studying the systems used in Mercedes-Benz competition cars, which pushed the small block's output to 1 horsepower per cubic inch on the highest specification version. 283 horsepower from 283 cubic inches. This was a benchmark that had been discussed in automotive circles as an aspirational target, and the Corvette reached it as a production automobile available in dealer showrooms across America. The car that had nearly been canceled 2 years earlier was now being discussed in the same sentences as European performance machinery. But something else happened in 1957 that changed the trajectory of the Corvette's racing program. The Automobile Manufacturers Association, responding to growing public concern about automobile safety and high-speed accidents, agreed to a ban on direct factory involvement in racing. General Motors, along with Ford and other manufacturers, signed the agreement. Duntov had been working on a full racing version of the Corvette, the SS, a purpose-built race car with a magnesium body and a fuel-injected engine producing more than 300 horsepower, intended for Sebring in 1957. The car ran. It was fast. Mechanical problems forced it out of the race after just 23 laps, and with the manufacturer's agreement now in place, GM officially withdrew from factory-sponsored motorsports. Officially. In practice, Duntov continued to develop the Corvette's performance and supported racing efforts in ways that maintained enough distance from formal factory involvement to satisfy the letter of the agreement, while not entirely abandoning the spirit of what he was trying to build. The Corvette's racing reputation continued to grow through private teams and individual drivers. But the SS program was over. What Duntov had built, in the space of about 3 years, was a car that could no longer reasonably be dismissed. The Corvette was no longer a pretty object with uncertain engineering underneath. It was a genuine performance automobile with a documented racing record, a state-of-the-art engine, and a constituency of buyers who had begun to build their identity around it. The transformation that happened between 1955 and 1962 is one of the more remarkable turnarounds in American automotive history. Not because the car's fundamental concept changed dramatically, but because a small number of specific decisions, made by specific people under specific pressure, turned a product that nearly didn't exist into a cultural anchor point. The body was redesigned for 1956 with a more aggressive, cleaner shape. The side coves, the more pronounced fenders, the elimination of the most awkward details from the original design. Roll-up windows finally appeared. The car began to look like what Harley Earl had originally imagined at Watkins Glen, something that belonged on a road with purpose. By 1960, the Corvette had found its audience, not the general American car-buying public. It was never going to challenge the Bel Air in volume. Its audience was something more specific. Engineers, pilots, doctors, young professionals who wanted a machine that communicated something particular about its owner. Not wealth exactly, but a certain kind of appetite. Speed, precision, a preference for a car that required attention rather than simply responding when called upon. American men who had spent years looking at imported sports cars they couldn't quite justify buying now had a domestic option that could compete on performance terms at a lower price. The Corvette filled a space in the American market that had existed since the late 1940s and had never been properly addressed. Then Bill Mitchell changed everything again. Mitchell had succeeded Harley Earl as GM's head of design in 1958, where Earl had invented modern automotive styling. Mitchell was its most flamboyant practitioner, a man who wore custom suits and thought about design the way a couture fashion designer thought about clothing. As an expression of personality so personal it could only belong to one person. He had been obsessed with the Corvette since the beginning. When the Racing SS program was canceled, Mitchell quietly acquired the car's assets for his own use and had it rebodied by designer Larry Shinoda. The result was a private racing car called the Stingray, which Mitchell ran under his own name to circumvent the manufacturer's agreement. The Stingray racer informed everything Mitchell did when he was given authority over the second-generation Corvette. Together with Shinoda, he created a shape that had almost nothing in common with what had come before. The new Corvette was lower, narrower, and shorter than its predecessor. Its body drew from marine biology, specifically from a mako shark that Mitchell had caught deep-sea fishing, whose coloring and silhouette he reportedly had a model of in his office throughout the design process. The lines were taut, aggressive, and deeply original. For the first time, the Corvette was offered as a closed coupe as well as a convertible. And on the coupe, Mitchell insisted on a design element that Zora Arkus-Duntov opposed immediately: a vertical bar running down the center of the rear window, splitting it in two. The argument between them was real and documented. Mitchell wanted the bar because the central crease line that began at the car's nose ran over the hood and roof, needed to continue uninterrupted to the tail. It was a design principle about visual continuity. Duntov argued that the bar dangerously obstructed rearward visibility. Both men were right in their own terms. Mitchell prevailed for the 1963 model year. Customer complaints confirmed Duntov's engineering concerns, and the bar disappeared for 1964. That single design decision, present for exactly 1 year, opposed by the car's own chief engineer, removed almost immediately due to driver complaints, made the 1963 split-window coupe one of the most valuable and sought-after Corvettes ever built. Decades later, the rarity of the split window and the story of its brief existence would make those cars extraordinarily desirable to collectors. A design compromise that created a safety concern inadvertently created a legend. When the 1963 Stingray reached showrooms, demand was immediate and sustained. The car looked unlike anything else on American roads. The design had escaped the gravity of its own history. This was no longer the awkward experiment from Flint's delivery garage. This was a machine that looked like it had been designed to win something, even in the parking lot of a shopping center. The second-generation Corvette confirmed what the first had only suggested. This car had become America's answer to a question the American automobile industry had spent years avoiding. The Corvette's passage from near cancellation to cultural permanence happened over a specific decade. And it happened through the work of a small number of people who understood something that the larger institution around them had not always grasped: that a sports car is not primarily a transportation device. It is an identity object. It communicates something about the person behind the wheel that a sedan cannot communicate, no matter how well engineered or comfortable that sedan might be. Duntov understood this from his SAE paper. Mitchell understood it from his design philosophy. Harley Earl had understood it from the beginning, sitting at Watkins Glen watching European machinery and seeing not just performance machinery, but the beginning of a new kind of American desire. By the middle of the 1960s, the Corvette had settled into a role that its creators had worked toward, but perhaps not fully anticipated in scale or permanence. It was the aspirational American automobile, the car that American men in their 20s put on the wall before they could afford one. The car that appeared in enough films and television programs to accumulate its own cultural weight, independent of any specific model year or engineering specification. The third-generation Corvette, which arrived in 1968 and remained in production until 1982, became the longest-running Corvette generation and the one that embedded itself most deeply in the texture of American popular culture. Its dramatically curved bodywork, derived from the Mako Shark II concept car and designed in an era of muscle car excess, was instantly recognizable. The C3 appeared in films. It appeared on album covers. Its T-top panels, which could be removed to create an open-air driving experience without requiring the commitment of a convertible, gave it a practical flexibility that matched the social mood of the late 1960s and 1970s. When the idea of freedom, physical, cultural, political, was being renegotiated across the whole of American life. The Corvette was never exactly the car of counterculture. It wasn't the vehicle of protest or rejection. It was something more complicated. The sports car of people who believed in the American system but wanted to live fast inside it. It was the car of test pilots and football coaches and small business owners who had grown up hearing about the car that could do 150 miles per hour on the sand at Daytona. The car that Prince would reference in a song. The car that would eventually be the one a president kept in his garage. It became, without anyone fully planning it, the car that resolved a particular American tension. The desire for European-style performance and the refusal to admit that European cars were better. The 1970s brought problems that Duntov had never had to navigate in his years of building horsepower records. The 1973 oil embargo, stricter emissions regulations, and new safety requirements all converged to compress the Corvette's performance figures in ways that looked, on paper, like the car was becoming less than it had been. Horsepower ratings dropped. The high-compression engines that had made the fuel-injected 327 of the early 1960s legendary gave way to lower-compression engines with catalytic converters and air pumps added to meet emission standards. The Corvette of the mid-1970s was a different machine in performance terms from the Corvette of 1965, and automotive writers said so. The criticism was fair, but the car's cultural weight was now entirely independent of its specification sheet. People still wanted Corvettes. Dealers still moved them. The waiting lists that developed during periods of high demand had nothing to do with the quarter-mile time or the top speed. They had to do with what the car represented in the imagination of its buyers. Duntov retired from General Motors in 1975, having spent more than 2 decades transforming a fiberglass show car with a 6-cylinder engine and an automatic transmission into the foundation of an American performance tradition. He had spent those years in a state of permanent creative tension with designers, executives, the racing establishment, and the regulations of his time, and had produced something that outlasted all of those conflicts. He once described his goal for the Corvette in terms that sound simple, but took a decade of work to make real. He wanted every driver who sat in it to believe, at the moment of sitting down, that the car was capable of more than they were. The irony that surrounds the Corvette's origin is the kind that only becomes visible from a distance. A car that was nearly canceled after 2 years of disappointing sales. A car whose first-year production took place in the back of a delivery garage, built almost entirely by hand by workers who had never assembled a fiberglass body before, became the longest continuously produced American sports car in automotive history. A car that arrived without a manual transmission, at a moment when the entire sports car tradition it was trying to join was defined by manual transmissions, became the benchmark against which American performance is still measured. The 300 cars built in Flint in 1953 were fragile things in every sense. Fragile mechanically, fragile commercially, built on enthusiasm and crowd response rather than market research or engineering confidence. The executives who authorized production weren't certain the Corvette would work. The engineers who built it knew its fundamental compromises. The dealers who sold it saw customers walk away. And yet, the car that almost didn't survive 1954 is still in production. The small block V8 that Duntov used to give it credibility became one of the most successful engine families in automotive history. The racing program that Duntov launched at Pikes Peak in Daytona established a performance identity that the car has never lost. The 1963 split-window coupe that Mitchell and Shinoda created. The one with the bar that Duntov opposed. The one that was removed after a single year because it created a safety problem. Sells at auction for sums that would have seemed absurd to anyone standing on the production line in Flint in 1953. Today, the Corvette is a mid-engine supercar. The C8 generation, which arrived in 2020, moved the engine behind the driver for the first time in the car's history. The layout that Duntov had spent much of his career at GM trying to implement against institutional resistance. He argued for it in the 1960s. He argued for it in the 1970s. The engineering logic was never seriously disputed. The timing, the cost, the production complexity, those arguments delayed it for 60 years. Duntov died in 1996. He never saw the mid-engine production Corvette that now carries his name in the form of the Duntov Award given to exceptional contributors to the Corvette community. The car that was almost killed before America made it an icon is now the car that Harley Earl sat in a crowd at Watkins Glen in 1951 and imagined from nothing. It took 7 decades, 3 near cancellations, 1 letter that changed the conversation, 1 speed record on a Florida beach, and 1 Belgian engineer who never stopped believing the car could be something the people above him weren't always sure they wanted it to become. The Corvette was supposed to be America's affordable sports car for the masses. It survived by becoming something more precise. The car that America built to prove it could build a sports car worth building. The difference between those 2 things is the history of everything that happened in between. And the Corvette wasn't the only American car that survived institutional doubt to become something its creators hadn't fully imagined. A few years before Earl was sketching roadsters at his desk, a very different kind of machine was being assembled under military contract in Toledo, Ohio. A vehicle designed for a specific war, built to specific dimensions, expected to disappear when the fighting stopped. It didn't disappear. It became something nobody planned and nearly everyone recognized. That car is the next story.